Alrighty, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's Ed Equity VA webinar. This afternoon's webinar is going to focus on strategies to support LGBTQ plus students in the 21st century classroom. My name is Janae Nurse, and I am the Equity Coordinator at the Virginia Department of Education, and I will help facilitate today's presentation. Today, we are joined by Ted Lewis and John Taylor, the Executive and Associate Directors of Side by Side, an organization that is dedicated to creating supportive communities where Virginia's LGBTQ plus youth can define themselves, belong, and flourish. It is so important that we are creating inclusive school environments in which all students feel safe and welcomed. And our presenters today will provide some valuable ways in which we can do just that, but considering the unique needs of our LGBTQ plus students. This will include considerations for our changing and global society, for social justice and the movement for Black lives, and for the COVID-19 learning environment. Before we get started, I am so glad to let everybody know that we are joined by Dr. James Lane, the Superintendent of Public Instruction, and Ms. Leah Walker, the Director of Equity here at DOE, and they will provide a few brief remarks before we dive into today's presentation. So Dr. Lane and Leah.
Wonderful. I am actually going to let Dr. Lane go first.
Okay, I'm happy to. Well, thank you all for being with us today on this very important topic. I know we've talked at length in the past in these webinars about economic equity, racial equity, and to now talk about how we can improve the supports that we provide to LGBTQ students is so important to us. And so thank you to Ted and John for being with us to talk to us and help us to learn more. Our work at the Commonwealth is focused on ensuring we're maximizing the potential of every child, no matter what their background is, and to make sure our students feel safe and supported in our schools along with their academics. And so excited that we have this topic for you today. And I know it's an issue that's near and dear to all of our hearts to make sure that we are keeping that focus on all students. And so thank you all for being here, and I'll turn it to Leah.
Thanks, Dr. Lane. And before you go, I just want to acknowledge and thank Dr. Lane for his continued support and courage to allow us to bring forward support and solutions and tools that really do meet the needs of all students, even when it is sometimes politically unpopular to do so. So, Dr. Lane, thank you for your continued support of Ed Equity VA and allowing us to continue to push the envelope. I want to also just thank Side by Side, who have been just such a wonderful partner to us in our work in our office. Always available to provide technical support to the development of documents at the Department of Education, really informing our policy development in this space and place, and also for signing on very early on in the year to be a part of our webinar series and bringing these resources to bear to the broader Virginia education community. And so I'm not going to belabor my talking points. I do just want to say that at the DOE, we really do take a holistic viewpoint and lens that we apply to our work to advance equity outcomes for all students. And while LGBTQ plus students don't show up necessarily as a student group in a reporting category on our data radar, we do know that those students have very specific and unique needs, that they are not always encountering welcoming learning environments that do truly support their individual identities. And so we're hoping that the tools, resources, and recommendations that our colleagues from Side by Side present today will help to better inform our practice in the state of Virginia and really just generate some new thinking around how we can be intentional in the way that we support students who identify as LGBTQ plus. And really, I think the practices that you're going to hear about today, I got a preview of the presentation, actually are good practices for all students. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it back over to Janae, who's going to go through our technical commentary and then formally introduce our presenters for the day.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lane and Leah. I do want to just give you all a few quick reminders before we jump into our presentation. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted to our website and YouTube channel for public access. We have allotted time for questions at the end of the presentation, but feel free to ask questions in the chat as they come to you. We will get to them. Please note that we will only take questions via chat though, but you can also use the anonymous Q&A feature. That is just a reminder that we will not be unmuting anybody's mics to ask questions. Everything will be taken through the chat. And then finally, I will email the slides of this webinar, the recording, and any resources that our presenters provide today to everybody following this webinar. So I am now excited to turn this over to the executive and associate directors of Side by Side, Ted Lewis and John Taylor. Thank you both so much for joining us today, and I'm so excited about this presentation.
Great. Thank you so much. And we are just delighted to be here. And we will getting used to this technology. There we go. So Ted, obvious who we both are from these photos, and as well. So I'm John Taylor. I'm going to be with you for a few minutes before I turn it over to Ted. And how to advance slides. If I could have some help with that, Jeannie. Okay, there we go. So we're going to go over some information about Side by Side. And so we were founded almost 30 years ago. So next year is a celebration time for us. So it's hard for me to believe that 91 is 30 years ago, but there it is. All this time we've been dedicated to creating supportive communities where Virginia's LGBTQ plus youth can define themselves, belong, and flourish. We provide support for groups in Richmond, Charlottesville, Petersburg, high school as well. And right now for all over Virginia through Zoom as well. We also provide homelessness services for LGBTQ plus youth, young adults 18 to 25 in Richmond. What you're looking at there is our building, our youth center in Richmond, near one of those giant golf things, and Sears Roebuck's outlet as well, if you're familiar with that. Okay. All right, so at Side by Side, we also offer training and consultation. We provide this training to educators on how best to support LGBTQ plus youth. We offer the basics training, which is understanding LGBTQ youth and understanding the identities, risk, and protective factors for youth and best practices for supporting them. The next training up, we go into the practice, so putting allyship into action, which is an interactive training, and getting into systemic oppression and how that works against the communities. We talk about gender and sexuality alliances, GSAs, and developing policies and practices to support, to more widely support throughout the school. We do consultations as well. So we do one-on-one consultation with school administrators. We can help answer some of the questions that you may be struggling with, or can share best practices on how to make your school more welcoming. Okay, next page, thanks. Okay, so the agenda for today, and we'll keep going. So who are LGBTQ plus students? Parent and family engagement, bullying and school discipline, school and emotional learning, and inclusive policies. So a few reminders for our times today, for our time together. So having an open mind is very helpful. There are some difficult stats that we're going to share with you as well. So just a heads up on that. This is new material, and with new material, we all make mistakes, and some of us continue to make mistakes. Even though my child came out 6 years ago, I continue to screw up. Push yourself to ask questions, and remember, you are not in this alone. We are ongoing partners with you, and we'll be there for you.
Thanks, John.
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead, Ted.
Thanks, John. It's always fun to present digitally and virtually because we can't always see each other in the cues and everything. So I'm going to go over our next section on who are LGBTQ students. And again, we're grateful to be here and glad for the opportunity to share with you. One note that we neglected to share early on that you'll see is we've packed a lot of content in our time together. And John and I are not going to go over every single detail of every slide. And that's intentional. We wanted to have the information in the slide deck so you would receive it afterwards for your records and your follow-up. But there are some highlights that we want to focus on today. Now, when the Equity Office reached out to us to provide this, it was, as Leah mentioned, a long time ago, and a lot has changed. And so we're going to update this as we go, and we're happy to provide you with links to more updated information that's come out as recent as last week for some of the data that we're going to share. Now, this is not a 101 training, but we did want to provide some very, very light basics of who are LGBTQ students. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, LGBTQ stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, or questioning youth. And the plus actually denotes that there are multitudes of terms that people use to define their gender and sexuality beyond that acronym. Now, when someone finds a term that fits who they are, it means they found a home, it means they found a community. And one of the things we know about LGBTQ young people is they often face isolation from their peers and their community as a whole. So finding a term that defines who you are actually makes you feel less isolated because you're not the only one. It makes you feel connected to others. And so if there's a term here you don't know and someone were to share it with you, maybe one of your students, responding appropriately is really important. And so it is okay to say, you know, I'm not sure what demi-boy means. Could you tell me what that means to you? That's engaging with the young person, giving them a chance to explain a little bit more about who they are and hearing it from their perspective. That's a much more appropriate way than saying things like, oh, I can't keep up with all these terms, or you all just come up with new words every week, even if that may be what's running in your head. John and I can attest that side by side, we hear new terms from our young people all the time. We are constantly keeping pace with the terminology that's coming out. And some of these words have made it into the dictionary, and some of them you're only going to find on Tumblr, but that doesn't make them more or less real or more or less valid. And really the goal here is to see young people for who they are, allow them to be their full authentic selves in productive ways in our school system where they can ultimately thrive. Now, when we look at how we talk about gender and sexuality at Side by Side, we actually use this identity spectrum. Instead of giving you definitions to discrete terms, we actually look at identity in terms of our sex assigned at birth, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation as four separate yet connected parts of who we are. And again, they're all on a spectrum. And that spectrum on the poles is sort of that normative narrative or that gender binary. It is what is expected of people in the world, right? And so in this case, in terms of LGBTQ folks, this would mean someone who is cisgender. In other words, their sex assignment lines up with what we would expect related to their gender identity. They were, for example, assigned male at birth and identify as a boy and later a man, as you see on that blue line on the left. They would also be gender conforming, meaning how they express themselves would line up with what we would expect. If they identified as a man, they would express themselves in a masculine way. And then sexuality-wise, they would be attracted to the quote unquote opposite gender. They would be heterosexual. This is, again, what is expected of folks. It is most Disney movies. It is why there's a king and queen of the prom. It is why we have stories that only sort of depict a small segment of our overall population. Now, if you find yourself in this normative narrative, that doesn't mean that you're a bad person. It doesn't mean that you are wrong. It just means that you are part of that dominant narrative. And LGBTQ people don't find themselves in that narrative, right? And so we need to expand what we mean when we think about who our students are. And in particular, think about expanding it in terms of gender, sexuality, expression, etc. Now, a couple of key things to also keep in mind. As I noted, these are four separate yet connected parts of who we are. A lot of times people confound, in particular, sexual orientation and gender identity. We had one mom who came to us and say, I get it, my kid's transgender, that means they're super gay. They're so gay that they're gonna change genders to then be heterosexual. That's not how it works. You can be both gay and transgender. They're not mutually exclusive categories. The second piece with this is that LGBTQ students are diverse in their experience. It's not a monolith. Not all LGBTQ students experience what we're going to share with you today, although you'll see the high percentages in surveys that's done that shows a commonality that's among most LGBTQ students. But again, not all LGBTQ students. So one student's lived experience being vastly different than what we're going to share today is not unexpected. Everybody has a different experience in life depending on how affirming their family is, their community is, and their school is, just to give you one example. Now, transgender students often face unique experiences due to how they are treated in society as a whole. And what I would say is that a lot of schools reach out to us to specifically talk about how they can include transgender students in their school environment. And we'll give you some examples later in the presentation of how this shows up and what's being done at the Virginia Department of Education that can guide you as you create more inclusive school environments. Lastly, LGBTQ students are a part of every school and every community. A lot of times we will hear from schools, well, we don't have any LGBTQ kids. What you mean is you may not have any out or openly LGBTQ students. They may not have shared their identity with you. They may not have even come out to their friends or to their family, but I can guarantee you LGBTQ students are a part of every community and every school. They are already in your school. They are already there, and they're already looking to you to see how they're going to be included or not. And we're more than one thing. We are more than just our gender and sexuality. There's lots of pieces of our identity that are constantly circling around us, that are interacting and intersecting at different levels. And how we engage with each other is going to depend not only on the identities that we already shared related to the LGBTQ community, but all of these other identities. For some LGBTQ students, being LGBTQ is in the top 4 of their identity. For some, it's not even in the top 10. Not all LGBTQ students focus on their gender and sexuality as part of their identity. Sometimes it's other pieces of who they are. We're going to talk a little bit in detail about some experiences of Black LGBTQ youth specifically because of some new data that's come out in recent years. Just to give you an example of how this looks different by changing one other factor. So comparing Black youth who are heterosexual and cisgender and Black LGBTQ youth, and then LGBTQ youth who are white versus Black LGBTQ youth specifically, right? Now, when we talk about how do we look at this from an intersectional approach, and our wonderful folks at the Equity Office set us up really for success when they talked about, we want you to really talk about the moment that we're in now. Well, a lot of us have been following the Black Lives Matter movement over the many years and the most recent iteration of uprisings that have occurred across the country after the killings of George Floyd. And I think what people often miss is that Black Lives Matter, at its root, is an intersectional approach to justice work. If you look at their website, if you look at their policy platforms, it includes many different aspects of humanity, including explicitly LGBTQ people. In fact, 2 of the 3 founders of the organization and the movement are actually members of the LGBTQ community. So while Black Lives Matter focuses on the experiences of Black people and centers Black people in their work, they look at it from an intersectional approach that actually looks at all Black lives. And through that approach, they are ensuring that they are taking action to really meet those who are on the most margins of our society or those that are most marginalized within our communities. Now, when we say marginalized with LGBTQ populations, what are we talking about? Well, here's some rather sobering statistics related to how LGBTQ youth currently exist in our communities. Lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth are 3 to 5 times more likely to attempt suicide compared to their heterosexual peers. And 42% of transgender people will attempt suicide in their lifetime, with the vast majority having their first attempt before the age of 20. At Side by Side, we do surveys every 6 months of the youth we serve. And one of the questions we ask is, have you seriously considered killing yourself in the last 6 months? Now, that number is going to be skewed because these are youth coming to us for support, but we wouldn't expect it to be as high as 70% as it was in 2017. And the lowest that number has ever been in our surveys is only 55%. LGBTQ youth are at significant risk for suicide because of how they are treated in the world, not because they're LGBTQ. Self-harm is an unhealthy, inappropriate way that people use to cope with the world around them. It's a way to take control of their body and their world. But again, it's not a healthy way to do that. And LGBTQ youth have higher rates of that self-harm behavior, which could look like cutting, burning, or intentionally harming themselves in some other way. While LGBTQ youth make up only 9% of the youth population in the US, they account for 19% of foster care youth and 40% of youth experiencing homelessness in the United States. We've seen that data backed up locally in Richmond, with 35% of youth experiencing homelessness being part of our community. And according to the Trevor Project, 29% of LGBTQ youth experience homelessness, run away, or are kicked out of their homes. While the LGBTQ community has made vast moves and progress, these statistics have not changed in the last decade. LGBTQ youth suicide, LGBTQ youth self-harm, and LGBTQ youth homelessness has remained high, in part because of the hostile environments that LGBTQ youth experience. Now, when we talk about, well, what about when we look at this from some different intersections? So this is data actually from the CDC, and we pulled data looking specifically at the experiences of Black, lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth compared to their heterosexual youth peers. And you can see the significantly higher rates of feelings of sadness and hopelessness, seriously considered suicide, and even a suicide attempt. A survey was done by the Human Rights Campaign last year that found 80% of Black LGBTQ youth usually feel depressed and down. 71% usually feel worthless or hopeless. 80% usually feel worried, nervous, or panicked. 46% feel critical of their LGBTQ identities, and only 35% received counseling in the past. The reality is there is a crisis among LGBTQ youth more broadly, and specifically LGBTQ youth of color, and even more specifically Black LGBTQ youth. And so as we get into our next section, where John's going to talk about parent and family engagement, which is one of the key protective factors for LGBTQ youth to avoid some of these feelings, I want you to think about, how would you navigate the day if you were a student and you usually felt depressed or down, worthless and hopeless, worried, nervous, and panicked, and be upset or even critical about who you were? Okay. So John, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk through parent and family engagement, and just let me know when you want me to click next, okay?
Okay, please click next. All right, thank you. So family engagement, family support is huge, and engage and supportive families provide that needed understanding, care, and resilience. And so if we have that in our families, then our youth are much better able to navigate everything else. Supportive families can mitigate other risk factors as well. So family rejection, lack of family support, can lead to conflict, running away, homelessness, increase in the overall risk for mental health problems, including depression, suicidal ideation among our youth. Next slide, please. All right, common experiences of parents and caregivers. So parents and caregivers are processing emotionally, cognitively, and trying to support their children as they catch up. So unlearning, learning, and relearning. And that was certainly my case. In our case, fortunately, our family all across the line was very, very supportive, but really beginning that unlearning and learning and relearning was certainly an aspect for me. Parents and caregivers use their own lived experiences and identities to prepare their children for the world. And if they aren't LGBTQ, they may feel unprepared. Absolutely. Parents and caregivers need their own space to process coming out. And so we have the PFLAG, which is an international organization, Parents and Friends of Lesbian and Gays. And then He, She, Ze, and We, which is a local Virginia organization that's quickly expanding, that supports parents of transgender children. Divorced and separated parents potentially give uneven levels of support or a complete lack thereof. And also, just so that we are aware, parents are LGBTQ as well. So yeah, next slide, please. So what do we do when caregivers and youth do not align? Trans student wants to use their chosen name and the caregiver is against it. So a gay student wants to be president of GSA and the caregiver is not supportive. Lesbian student wants to bring a same gender date to the prom, and a caregiver is angry that the school would allow this. Next slide. As well. So what do we do? That is the question, right? Is to work on that. Okay. So parent family support, I talked about PFLAG a little bit, and then He, She, Ze, and We, which has been a fabulous organization for me, and that I'm still involved in years later.
Thanks, John, for that. And I appreciate you sharing some of your own experiences. You know, when we talk about LGBTQ youth, one of the other big areas that we run into is bullying and school discipline. And so that's what I'm going to talk a little bit now about. Now, literally just last month, GLSEN, the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network, came out with their 2019 data, and we haven't had a time to update this yet. So the data we have is a little bit old, but I will actually send a link out to folks to be able to see the 2019 data that, again, just was released. So when we look at 2017 data, which is not that different from 2019 data, we see that LGBTQ high school students in Virginia experience bullying at significantly high rates. No surprise there. And in particular, we see this around the language that's used in schools. So that using gay in a negative way, right? Saying that's so gay, when you're saying gay meaning bad or wrong, homophobic remarks or negative remarks around transgender people or gender expression, you see that high rates of high school students in Virginia reporting this is happening on a frequent, regular basis. Well, when we look at other behaviors such as verbal harassment, so not just the, oh, someone said that's so gay, but the repeated name calling, the repeated harassment verbally of an LGBTQ student based on their sexual orientation, their gender expression, or their gender identity, you see those high rates there. And then when we talk about physical harassment, this would be like pushing or shoving of someone who is LGBTQ because, again, of their sexual orientation, their gender expression, or their gender identity. And then physical assault is punching, kicking, or more intense than physical harassment. But again, you see the high levels here. Now, you may think, well, it's only 12% for students being targeted for their gender identity. But again, that's a pretty high percentage of students who are experiencing that physical harassment in an environment that they're required to attend every day, where they're hoping to learn and grow. And so when we talk about bullying, this is where a lot of times our focus is. And we want to address the bullying that's happening. But side by side, we would never tell you to not address that bullying. But we want to dig into this a little bit more. Now, again, there's some new data that's come out that talks about the experiences specifically of Black LGBTQ youth in school. One, we know that 40% have been bullied on school property within the last year. Only 35% can definitely be themselves at school. Now, this statistic in particular is important because, again, we often hear from schools, well, we don't have any LGBTQ students here. Well, if only 35% of Black LGBTQ students report that they can be themselves, can be out at school, imagine how many more students are in the closet or hiding their identities from their teachers, their counselors, or even their peers. And 67% had been verbally insulted because of their LGBTQ identity. Sometimes that is also coming, unfortunately, from school staff, not just from peers. And when we look at rates, again, from the CDC of bullying, comparing Black, lesbian, and gay and bisexual youth to their Black heterosexual peers, you see that they are more likely to be electronically bullied, more likely to be threatened with a weapon, more likely to experience sexual violence, more likely to experience physical dating violence, and more likely to skip school because they don't feel safe. So again, as we talk about how do we address it, we have to have that intersectional approach, right? And what do we know about bullying? Well, first and foremost, hurt people, right? We know that to be true. Hurt people, hurt people. Individuals who are most vocal in their anti-LGBTQ sentiment are often struggling with their own gender and sexuality. Because the easiest way to hide as a closeted LGBTQ person is to call out and draw attention to someone else. I'm not gay. Look at that guy. He's definitely gay. Let's get him. It shifts the focus away from that individual and puts it somewhere else. Anti-LGBTQ language such as slurs or jokes are often used by teens who are struggling with their own identity because they're testing how their peers might react. If they pick on the out LGBTQ kid and their peers join in, then they feel like, oh, well, I'm not going to share who I am. And the easiest way for them to hide themselves is to point the attention somewhere else. Right? So as we think about this, we need to rethink how we do discipline. And I know many of you are doing this already in the Commonwealth, and we're having important conversations about what school discipline looks like and approaching it from a community place and from a place of empathy. And what we see again is that relying on strict discipline or even law enforcement has actually not resulted in a decrease in bullying in our schools, but instead has had extremely negative results for youth of color, and specifically LGBTQ youth of color. This is some graphics that come from the Center for American Progress, and they talk about how schools are funneling LGBTQ youth into the school to prison pipeline, and in particular, again, LGBTQ youth of color. So you see here in the data they've pulled, LGBTQ youth make up 5 to 7% of the youth population they surveyed. And yet they represent 15% of those in the juvenile justice system. And the vast majority are Black or Latinx. And why is that? Well, part of it's that hostile school environment. Lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth are 3 times more likely to experience harsh disciplinary treatment by administrators compared to their non-LGBT peers. Some of that is bias, and some of that is actually schools trying to address bullies who are hiding their sexuality, right? Studies show that higher rates of punishment don't correlate to higher rates of misbehavior among LGBTQ youth. In other words, the harsher punishments don't work. And 1/3 of LGBTQ youth report that school officials fail to address harassment. When they come with a complaint to the school, they're often met with silence. And if they're met with silence, that means they're less likely to come back to that school for support. The other thing we know about bullies is that oftentimes they're reenacting violence they experienced somewhere else, sadly, often in the home. And so a more thoughtful way to approach this is to certainly center and address the victimized student who's being picked on, who's being bullied, but also build empathy for the bully and figure out, why are they acting this way? One of the ways that we talk about this at Side by Side is, again, to reframe this idea of bullying. So if a young person were, for example, to call me a name in a school, I actually often respond with, who hurt you? What happened that made you have that reaction for me simply existing here? Why are you so angry? What's going on? Are you having a bad day? Are you okay? I'm trying to build that empathy to understand why someone is lashing out that way. Now, this is not an easy task to do. It's not something most of our youth can do. It's not something I can do consistently. Because trust me, when I get called a name on the street, my first reaction is not to turn around and ask someone how their day is going. But that is actually a more thoughtful way to approach this. And as educators, if we can actually approach it from that questioning standpoint and providing space to hear our young people out for why they're behaving the way they are, I think we're more likely to get to some real answers. The last piece we want to note in this section is around community blowback, because we're seeing this on the rise in recent years. The most famous example is the Gavin Grimm case. Gavin Grimm was a transgender boy, assigned female at birth, identifies as a boy, and he went to school in Gloucester County. And he was he was using the boys' restroom. And the school board found out, and they said, you're not allowed to use the boys' bathroom. And there was a court case, went all the way to the Supreme Court, got punted back to the Fourth Circuit. Fourth Circuit released some new rulings this summer that affirmed that schools do need to allow transgender students to use the facilities that align with their consistent gender identity, whether or not they have legally changed their gender marker within the state system or the federal system. But Gavin received death threats, was bullied by not only his peers in school, but by other parents. He was called names such as it and thing at school board meetings. And we've seen that continue in other school board meetings throughout the Commonwealth. One county we went to, they were talking about adding inclusive non-discrimination policy to add sexual orientation and gender identity to protected classes within their school district. This was before the Virginia Values Act that just went into effect July 1st. which now requires that around the Commonwealth. But at the school board meeting, we listened as parents would talk horribly about LGBTQ and specifically transgender students. So imagine you're a student, a high school student, you're going to learn about your school engagement, you're going to share your experiences, and you're hearing your friends' parents call you a thing, call you it, say that you're mentally disturbed, say that you're sick, say that you're an abomination. That's going to have a toll on your mental well-being, particularly because in those public meetings, those comments are often not regulated by anybody who's there. That's going to have an impact, right? And we see examples of this even in how the media covers stories about LGBTQ people. And so there's a fear of parent pushback simply acknowledging that LGBTQ people even exist in curriculum. And a lot of school districts shy away from talking about LGBTQ people because they're worried about that parent blowback and that community pushback. That culture war of viewing LGBTQ people's existence as political. Who I am is not political. How I engage in my community might be, but who I am shouldn't be a political conversation. Every time LGBTQ people are made the subject of conversation on a national level, good, bad, or ugly, it's going to trickle down into our school environments. And I can tell you right now, LGBTQ youth are having a difficult time because their very existence is being debated by the highest offices in our country. And so again, when we talk about how do we support students, we have to see the full picture. And part of that full picture for LGBTQ students is to understand how the outside world is coming into our schools and into our classrooms. When the President of the United States says transgender people cannot serve openly in the military, what does that do for a transgender student in your ROTC program? Where they have planned to serve their country and ultimately get their college education because of their service, what does that mean for their future plans? What does that mean for what they want to do when they grow up? That age-old question we ask our young people all the time. That's just one example of what I mean of that outside world coming in, right? So now we're going to shift again. John's going to talk a little bit about what social and emotional learning looks like. Now, this has slides with a lot of content on it, but again, John did that so that you all would have this for your records. We're just going to kind of briefly talk about what it looks like for LGBTQ students. So John?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. So yeah, just like taking it out a little bit, the understanding of social emotional learning are these 5 areas. So self-awareness, self-management, responsible decision-making, relationship skills, social awareness. So instilling these, first within that inner circle where, we have more control, we, the collective we here, within our classrooms and through curriculum and instruction. Helping to support this throughout the school environment and then within the community. And so school-wide family practices and then community partnerships that support social and emotional learning. Next slide, please. And so, yes, a lot of words here, but the social emotional learning for LGBTQ plus youth is definitely something that is found to be supportive in academic circles and among parent groups and in other areas. So in order to make a school safer and welcoming, helping to implement some of these policies, that so that the unique challenges can be better faced through that. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide. Thanks. AmazeWorks is one of the organizations, and there's a link there below. So it helps to provide core programs and that advance equity and inclusion, that combines literature, children's literature, and skill building exercises that really from an age appropriate way spark discussions about difference. Okay. Next slide. And so there are some excellent suggested inclusive learning opportunities that start way within the early elementary programs, by GLSEN and other organizations, and then also through upper elementary and so on as well. And middle school and high school as well. So a lot of teams and organizations have really put their heads together on how to implement this within school. So there's great resources there.
Thanks, John.
Sure.
And again, we went through that quickly, intentionally, so that we could get to your questions, but we did want to include some of those great resources that John included in the presentation for you all. All those links, again, are in the slides. You'll be able to access everything that you just saw. We went through it quickly again, because it was really just some examples that we really don't have time to dig into right now. But when we get to Q&A, if you've got more questions, John or I'd be happy to answer them. So our last section, we're going to just talk about, well, what does policy look like? We've been throwing this around a little bit. And so I want to take us back, step back for a moment and think about how we approach when we design policies and procedures. What does it look like? So when we think about this, I'm going to give you an example with sexuality. First and foremost, there's this ideology, that heterocentrism. That's that gender binary we talked about before, that normative narrative. This is the idea that everyone is heterosexual. Now you may be saying, well, that's not an ideology we have anymore. It absolutely is. One of the reasons I know that it absolutely is because LGBTQ people are still expected to come out as a different gender or sexuality than heterosexual or cisgender. It's not that Ellen DeGeneres wasn't a lesbian before she told other people. It's that she was assumed to be heterosexual. That assumption, that's that ideology. That's the assumption that everyone is heterosexual, the assumption that that is the default, that that is the best, that everyone wants to be heterosexual. That ideology then feeds into a system of laws, policies, procedures, rules that's based on the assumption that everyone meets the ideological norm. Everyone is heterosexual. Homophobia is the individual manifestation of hate, anger, frustration, uncomfortableness with someone who doesn't fit that ideal. We spend a lot of time focused on that individual behavior, and we need to. That's important. We just talked about addressing bullying, for example. We have to talk about that individual level. And we need to spend a little bit more time talking about the system. How does the system benefit heterosexual and cisgender students, sometimes at the cost of their LGBTQ peers? That system is going to harm much more people than that individual peer that calls someone a name. That ideology, though, is so infectious that if we don't address and at least recognize that ideology being there, we can't actually address the system. So let me give you an example with the system. Now, on a college campus, why don't we have men and women share bedrooms? What are we afraid might happen? Right? You could think about this in another way in the K through 12 context. Why don't we let boys and girls share hotel rooms on field trips? We're afraid that they might have sex. That's one of the fears. So if I want to ensure, in this example on a college level, that no roommates ever have sex, I'm going to put all of the men in the blue dorm and all of the women in the pink dorm, and therefore no roommates will ever have sex. Have I accomplished my goal? No, of course not. Now, the reason I haven't accomplished this is because LGBTQ people exist in the world. This system assumes that everyone is heterosexual, that everyone is cisgender, and that there are only two genders. It is based on that ideology that we talked about. And so when this system was designed, it's not as if the person that runs the housing program on a college campus said, you know, I hate gay people so much that I'm gonna let them live with their partners and have sex anytime they want while they're here at school. No one ever said that. That doesn't make sense. What's more likely to happen is that when it was designed, LGBTQ people were not a part of the conversation. They weren't thought of as meaningful members of the society that was being created, of the community that was being created. When we talk about trying to address systemic oppression, we continue to look for a villain. Systemic oppression is the villain. It does not require an individual to have malicious intent to still cause harm. Systemic oppression does not require a villain. So if you approach your school system with the idea of let's look at policies from a new frame to say, if I'm a transgender student, how would I navigate our students' code of responsibility or our code of ethics or whatever you call your student handbook? How would a transgender student authentically participate in your school environment? It doesn't mean that the school is trying to actively harm transgender kids or LGBTQ kids more broadly, but it means we weren't a part of the conversation when those policies and procedures and practices were being developed. Take away the finger pointing. Focus more on how can we, now that we know better, do better, and include LGBTQ people in the conversation. This framework is helpful for any student group that's marginalized. We could have the same conversation about students of color, around immigrant and refugee youth, around students with disabilities, etc. We see this all the time. Again, it's not a malicious intent necessarily. It doesn't mean that there's not somebody who's still homophobic or transphobic, but what it does mean is let's not focus our attention on that if we're talking about policy. Let's focus on the policies and procedures and how we can actually make positive change. Right? Now, one of the biggest areas that we get questions on is how do transgender youth, or students rather, engage in our school systems? How do we do this in the right way? Well, I've got some good news for you. Earlier this year, the General Assembly passed and Governor Northam signed into law HB 145, SB 161, which directed the Virginia Department of Education to develop guidance for how to treat transgender students in our K-12 schools. That guidance is set to come out next month from the Department of Education, and it will allow for school districts to have some idea of what policies they need to put into place in the local level. And according to this new law, school districts are required to have new policies in place before the 21-22 academic year. Now, Side by Side has already released, in partnership with many other groups, what we feel are good policy recommendations for schools that align with the bill. Now, this bill specifically talks about being in compliance with applicable non-discrimination laws, the biggest of which I have mentioned before is the Virginia Values Act, which again went into law as of July 1. The Virginia Values Act provides protections for non-discrimination against or for LGBTQ people in terms of housing, credit, employment, and public accommodations, right? And so you can no longer legally discriminate against LGBTQ people in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Now, just because something is illegal doesn't mean it's not still happening. We know illegal things happen all the time, right? But I'm telling you at least what is on the books. There's a couple other laws that we don't have time to go into great detail on, but one I wanted to note is that now, as of again, July 1, in the Commonwealth of Virginia, you can get a state-issued ID, such as a driver's license, that has an X on your gender marker instead of male or female. That means you can have legal documentation in the Commonwealth to show a non-binary identity. I don't know a lot of school districts that are set up to legally reflect that student's identity, which again is now being affirmed by the Commonwealth. That's an example of what I mean about the changing laws that are happening in our Commonwealth that we need to actually be focused on as we create these new policies. It also includes maintenance of a safe and supportive learning environment, free from discrimination and harassment for all students, prevention of and response of bullying and harassment. It also includes, what about student records? What about how we identify students? What about protections of student privacy and confidentiality of sensitive information? Or even dress codes? And lastly, student participation in sex-specific school activities and events, excluding athletics, and use of school facilities, such as bathrooms or locker rooms. So again, guidance is going to come out next month from the Department of Education, and then we will be working with school districts, as I'm sure the department will, on creating those inclusive policies. Some school districts in Virginia already have some of these inclusive policies in place. We know of inclusive policies in Fairfax County, for example. We also know that Richmond City Public Schools, for example, has an inclusive non-discrimination policy already, as do Stafford County and many other school districts across the Commonwealth. But we also know a lot of schools are looking for this guidance. They want to know, how do I get this right? They want to line up with current case law and what we're seeing come out of the Fourth Circuit and what may eventually come out of the Supreme Court. This summer, the Supreme Court ruled in a Title VII case that it is against the law to discriminate against people based on their sexuality or their gender identity. That was affirmed in the Bostick case this summer. Now, I'm not a legal scholar, I'm not a lawyer, but I can tell you most Title IX cases stem from Title VII. They use the same interpretation of that law. So I wouldn't be surprised if we saw similar rulings coming out in the future related to Title IX as we've seen with Title VII. One area that we did want to note, because we have some good data that's come out in recent years, is how transgender students use their chosen name. A chosen name is similar to a nickname, but a little more in depth. It's the name a transgender person uses to reflect their identity. Names are often gendered, right? So for example, Ted is a name we often associate with men and masculinity. Leah is often a name we associate with women and femininity, right? That doesn't mean that there are no women who are Ted and that there's no men who are Leah, but again, that's not what we would expect. So gender is a piece of this name as well. So research shows that consistently using a transgender youth's chosen name at school, home, work, and with their friends dramatically decreases severe depression, decreases thoughts of suicide, and decreases suicide attempts. You do this already in your classrooms. My legal name is Theodore. And ever since I was a kid, I have hated my legal name. Because growing up for me in the 80s and 90s, it meant I was the short, fat, stupid chipmunk of Alvin and the Chipmunks. And I got teased endlessly because of Theodore. So I went by Ted. And I've never had a teacher or a counselor or a principal tell me, well, I have to call you Theodore. That's what your mom named you. That's what's on your birth certificate. That's what's on your official record. That's what I have to call you. People call me Ted. No one called home to my mom to say, is it okay if we call Ted Ted? Or do we have to use Theodore? No one ever called to do that. You just did it. We don't do the same for transgender students. And again, I'm not saying a nickname is the same as a chosen name, but it's similar enough that I would hope we could create similar policies. If we know that doing something as simple as allowing a student to use their chosen name consistently is going to dramatically decrease their risk for suicide, I would hope we'd be willing to do it. This has become even more important in a virtual setting, as student names are now showing up in the virtual classroom or on Zoom calls. It also is meaning that we're seeing a lot more teachers recognize pronouns and allowing students to include their pronouns in their signatures, in their names rather, on their Zoom calls, like you see that both John and I have done here. And when we think about this, imagine if you were to log in to your school system and you're a student, and every day you're confronted with a piece of who you are that you don't like. That name that you got picked on for. Imagine every day logging in, trying to learn, and that's the first thing that meets you. That's how important this is, right? Now, the last thing I wanted to note, and then we are going to open it to questions, and we hope you have a lot of them, are around the importance of gender and sexuality alliances. Now, these are often after-school clubs. They allow LGBTQ students to feel less isolated and less alone. That allows them to connect with each other, make them feel like they're not the only one. And it actually provides education and information to the general student body. I am repeatedly surprised at how quickly school climates can change. One school we worked with locally here in the greater Richmond area, their first year, they had a GSA with 8 students. And that first year was pretty rough. They were still seeing a lot of bullying. They were still seeing a lot of pushback. The second year of that GSA, 50% of that high school had only known that high school with the GSA. Because the first year in sophomore classes, it had always been there. So the second year, they got a standing ovation at their homecoming parade. Fast forward to today, it is the largest student club at that high school with over 100 members. It's also one of the most popular student clubs. That was a 6-year change. That's how quickly this can change and evolve. GSAs have shown, not surprisingly, to lower anti-LGBTQ bullying. No surprise there, right? Interestingly enough, having a GSA has shown to reduce school suicides among students for all students, not just LGBTQ students. The second group that's most likely to benefit indirectly from a GSA is actually heterosexual cisgender boys. Because often the bullying language we use against boys and even men is homophobic at its root. And when we take that out and say that is unacceptable, and that is being seen as unacceptable by their peers and by their teachers and by the school environment as a whole, it reduces that being thrown around. So GSAs are a simple way to provide a space for LGBTQ and allied students to connect with each other. Many court cases have shown that public schools cannot dictate the content of after-school programs. If you allow students to assemble for any other club or group, you cannot not allow them to assemble for a GSA. So if you've got a drama club, you got to let a GSA happen at your school. And you can't have different rules for the GSA than you have for other groups. If you don't require parental permission for the Spanish club, you can't require it for the GSA either. You can have the same policies for everyone, or you could have no after-school programs, as some of those school districts have done, but you can't dictate different rules for different schools. Again, this is backed up by case law, including court cases of public schools in Virginia, dating back to the 1970s. Now, we've also included some links in the slides. I just want to very briefly go over these and then we'll open it up to questions. GLSEN, as I mentioned before, does have a lot of education resources. They have a lot of research on LGBTQ students. They also have some great lesson plans and GSA supports. GSA Network, not surprising, network of GSAs. It's a national organization, started out in California, but now is nationwide. They also have a lot of Southern chapters. And GSA Network, again, has great lesson plans, as well as ideas for how GSAs can create educational opportunities within their own schools. The Trevor Project is a national organization focused on LGBTQ youth suicide and ending it. They have some great resources. They have a 24/7, 365 hotline, and you can get free hotline resources from them simply by filling out a form on their website. PFLAG, as John has mentioned before, and before we actually used their acronym. I don't think they actually use that acronym anymore, but it used to stand for Parents, Family, Friends of Lesbians and Gays. They do work with parents and families across all the LGBTQ community, just to clarify. Sorry if that wasn't clear before. And PFLAG does have chapters throughout the Commonwealth. They're often volunteer run. If you go to PFLAG's website, you can see where those chapters are. He, she, ze, and we, as John noted, parents and family of transgender youth and transgender people of all ages. They were founded in Richmond, but they are expanding. They just recently got nonprofit status. Gender Spectrum, national organization that focuses on gender expansive or non-binary and transgender students and youth. And then Teaching Tolerance is the education wing of the Southern Poverty Law Center. And they have lesson plans and research for K-12 teachers and educators and administrators, including LGBTQ specific resources. So now is your time. And we're going to do our best to field your questions. We intentionally booked a significant amount of time here at the end to answer your questions because we wanted this to be your time to ask us things, to learn more. And Janae, are you still with us? I believe you were going to help facilitate that.
Yes, I'm still here. Thank you both so much for that lovely presentation. Let's see what we have going on here in the chat. We did have a couple of questions come in. For those of you still on with us, if you have any additional questions, please feel free to add them into the chat, or you may use the anonymous Q&A feature. Let's see, I'll start here. How do we support teachers who may be holding back from reading a book that has an LGBTQ plus character because they might be afraid of the negative reaction from parents? So more broadly and more generally, how do we help to support teachers that are trying to be a little bit more courageous in this area, but maybe receiving some pushback from their communities?
So the first thing I will say is the best way to be a supportive educator is to still be employed in your school. That's number one. And so the best advice I give anyone is if you ever have that moment where you're like, I don't know if this is going to go over well, talk to your leadership at your school. Make sure that you have buy-in from your leadership in the curriculum that you're teaching. Make sure that any curriculum you're teaching that they are aware of. That shouldn't be a surprise to your leadership that you're reading a certain book. And if you've got that gut feeling, You don't want to go out on a limb and put yourself in hot water or your school in hot water. Now, I know that's not the answer a lot of folks like to hear, but that's what I would say is the best. You can't help anybody if you're not at the school anymore. So the first thing is to stay employed, right?
In the same vein, Ted, I have a question here specifically about like school board leaders, so leaders more generally. Do you have any advice for how to hold those individuals accountable?
So, I mean, part of this is having an understanding of how your school board operates. Now, it was mind-blowing to me to understand that some school boards in Virginia are elected and some are appointed. So that's first. You got to know how your school board is selected. If they're appointed, who are they appointed by? Can you reach out to that office with some concerns you may have? If they're elected, the way we hold elected officials accountable is elections, right? So that is, again, one way to hold folks accountable. More specifically, I think right now, because there are new laws in the Commonwealth, like the Virginia Values Act that includes non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people, like the new laws directing the Department of Education to develop these policies for transgender students, there is a little bit more weight in holding folks accountable to what is expected of them. And so sometimes it's as simple as saying, you know, did you know about this new law that just went into effect July 1? I just learned about it on this webinar. I wanted to make sure as our school board officials, you were aware of this because I think it might impact how we work with our students, right? And sometimes, to be honest with you, it really is that simple. Now, I work with school boards all the time and I have seen the pushback, I have seen the blowback. The biggest things I can tell you is a lot of times school boards are fielding a lot of different things with competing interests. And so the more information I can provide those school board leaders so that they can make informed decisions, the more likely they are to make informed decisions because they've got more information. The second thing is I have to be able to do follow-up. The biggest thing that I have seen people forget is that when something goes right, we forget to say thank you. Everybody wants to call when something goes wrong. Everybody wants to call. It's the Yelp factor, right? Everybody wants to write the review when the restaurant messes up your order. No one wants to write the review when everything went perfect. Right? So if a school board member does something that you agree with, a quick email. Thank you so much for supporting it. Really appreciate, grateful for your work. Simple. When school board members don't side in the way that I would hope they would, when they sort of come up short, when we talk about inclusion and equity, I still follow up. You know, we didn't see eye to eye on this, but I wanted to follow up with some additional information. I'd love to meet with you to talk more about this population and hope that maybe in the future, you'll see it a different way. I come from a place of empathy, right? Come from a place of answering questions, right? I just want to say last thing real quick. If you email anybody, including me, and say, let me tell you what you're doing wrong with your life, they're not going to answer you. So come from a professional place, come from a place of empathy, and come from a place of sharing information. Sorry, Janae, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No, my apologies. I wanted to thank you for sharing those insights, though. This next question that we have here is about a specific population of students that are in detention centers. So thinking more broadly to students in non-traditional settings, can you provide any considerations for acclimating students or helping students that may be getting discriminated against by their peers in some of those non-traditional school settings?
Right. So with detention centers, one thing is to be aware of the rules and regulations around PREA, the Prison Rape Elimination Act. And while that has a very scary name, it does include specific sort of policy guidance on how to treat LGBTQ people in detention centers, both on an adult level and on the juvenile level. So that's one. The second piece is that there are the same rules around bullying apply in detention centers that do in other settings. Hurt people hurt people. Those who are struggling with their own gender and sexuality are most likely to call somebody else out, right? So in detention centers that you know we've worked in before, what we often say is one way is to share that information with the youth, right? If this one kid, let's say, you know, I'm gonna come up with names. Joe is beating up Bill because Bill's gay. Joe, why are you worried about Bill being gay? Are you worried? Are you concerned? Are you gay? Is that why, right? There's actually a fascinating example of this that happened in pop culture recently. The former heavyweight champion of the world, Mike Tyson, did a podcast interview with the rapper Lil Bootsy. Now, I'm probably saying half of these names wrong because I don't know hip hop culture as well as I should. But Lil Boosie has been very public in his homophobic comments. And Mike Tyson asked him in a podcast interview, why are you so worried about gay people? Are you gay? Why do you care? You spend a lot of time focused on gay people. Why is that? Now, again, this is actually a great example of Mike Tyson asking thoughtful questions of Boosie of why are you focused on this, right? So again, in that, I'm using that example because if you were to share in a detention center what Mike Tyson, the heavyweight fighter, and this rapper, who they are cultural figures that these youth may know, right? They may be more likely to listen to it, but it also gives you an example of how you could start asking those questions. Now, I'm not saying Mike Tyson said all the right words or did it perfectly, but again, it's that way of confronting that bias and asking those thoughtful questions. What's going on with you, right? What is, why are you focused on Bill and Bill's sexuality? Did something happen, right? And the last thing I'll just say is it's gonna also come from you all as the adults in that space. If you all are treating those young people with respect, if you're using the right names and pronouns, if you're using those supportive language, if you are being inclusive in how you talk about relationships, how you talk about people in the world, they're more likely to respond. So there's some general pieces. I'm also happy to give you some resources if you want to reach out directly to us, and our contact information is again in the slides. But great question. That's just some examples.
All right, Ted and John, I just have that came through in the chat. This is about a specific guidance in relation to GSAs, gay straight alliances, in a distance environment. Do you have any resources, any tips? Can you point this person in the right direction?
So it's hard. I'm not gonna act like it's not. What I will say, my answer today in November is very different than my answer in April, right? Many of us have been on virtual learning or in the virtual setting, working from home since the pandemic began in March. We are much more used to this setting than we were in April, than we were in even June, than we were in even October. I say that because young people now that we are seeing in our support groups are much more comfortable in the Zoom platform, sharing their experiences, asking questions, engaging with each other. So we have seen school districts that do still host GSA meetups. They share the announcements in whatever their school platform is, right? So, GSA club's gonna meet Tuesday, 3:30 after school, or whatever your time frame is. Here's the link if you want to join. You create a space for folks to log in. And the biggest factor I would say with GSAs, or the biggest benefit, is again, those young people feeling less isolated and less alone. So the more they can connect with their peers who are maybe a part of the community that they're a part of, or allies to the community that they're a part of, is really helpful. And so you can absolutely do this in a virtual setting. We're working with a school out in Albemarle County, and they had a middle school, and they had their first GSA meeting virtually. The middle school had not had a GSA before, and they were like, we're going to try it. We had done some training with them. We sent them some materials. They said, we're going to start. They had 22 students show up for their first meeting. It was a pretty decent sized meeting for their first time out, with these students not knowing anything about it. They just said, we're going to do this, see who shows up, right? So again, it's one of those things, and I hate to use this because it's so cliche, but if you build it, they will come, right? If you create the space, oftentimes youth and LGBTQ youth and their allies will come out of the woodwork and seek you out for that support, right? If you reach out, there is some good information on GSA Network's website on virtual GSAs that has come out recently. And at Side by Side, we've obviously, some of our John and I's colleagues like Helen Mays, they've worked with a lot of school-based systems on GSAs. There's actually a section on our website now on GSAs that you can go to find Helen's contact information and other resources. And again, the key thing is that ability to connect with each other and to talk about what's going on and to share stories. A lot of times, what we've seen in GSAs in the virtual settings is, well, let me back up for a minute. One thing to note, we've seen this not only in schools, but in corporations that we've worked with. Students and adults who are LGBTQ, and specifically those who are transgender, have been coming out in the virtual setting because it's safer to do so. It is a lot easier for a student to come out in a virtual classroom and test the waters with their peers and their teachers when they don't have to be physically with them every day, walking the halls, using the bathroom, etc. So if you've been virtual for a while, I would not be surprised if more out LGBTQ and specifically more out transgender students showed up at your school when you're back in person, because we are seeing that all across the board. And we're seeing that with adults as well. So you may even have colleagues, for, fellow educators who are coming out in the virtual setting because it's safer to do so, right? It's a way to test the waters without having to be in it all the time. With that said, because of that, we also see some GSAs have reported they've had higher attendance in the virtual setting because it's less likely that their peers that aren't supportive are going to see them, right? So let's say you have a GSA in a school setting, we're all meeting in room 101. Well, if everybody knows that GSA is meeting in room 101 and I'm already nervous about my peers finding out about me, I may not go to room 101 if they're going to maybe see me go. It sounds kind of paranoid, but again, you got to put yourself in that mindset of someone who's afraid of how their peers are going to react, afraid of how they might be treated, is going to hide who they are. So the virtual setting actually provides a safer environment for them to do it than even that in-person meeting. So we've seen some GSAs actually really blossom in the virtual setting because they don't have that sort of in-person fear that some youth experience, right? So those would be the big things. The last thing I will say with this is also an opportunity to build bridges among marginalized students, and we would encourage you to do this also in person. We've seen this in several counties across the Commonwealth and other districts where they will invite, the GSA and the Muslim student group and the Black student group and the Latinx student group. Let's come together and have a virtual meeting together to talk about our experiences and share what we're seeing in our school, right? That actually, again, builds that ally network, lessens that feeling of isolation, and allows students to learn from each other about different identities. Because there are actually going to be Afro, Latinx, Muslim, lesbian students. Those people exist in the world. So there's probably a student that's going to be in every single one of those clubs because of their multiple identities. And so being able to bring those together means their fullness of who they are gets to be seen, but it also means that they get to celebrate that fullness with their different constituency groups all in one place, right? So that's another idea, is to try to bring those student groups together to talk about their experiences and share some of the joy of what it means to be parts of these various groups and identities.
Thank you so much, Ted and John. You've shared a great deal of information that I'm sure is going to be useful to so many people across the state, just plugging us into different organizations, resources, tools that we can definitely go to when we're looking for more information on how to best support our students, because that's really what this is all about. At this time, I do want to plug everybody into our next webinar, actually our final webinar for the year, which will be taking place on December 8th. It's Culturally Courageous Leaders and Educators, and we'll be talking about how to have open and honest conversations that center equity. And so we'll be hearing from our colleagues in Franklin County, Virginia, that have really done a great deal of work in this area, and we're looking forward to that. Following this webinar, I'm actually going to share the slides that our presenters went over today, as well as their contact information and some of the resources that they have shared here today. This is how you can get in contact with our office if we can ever be a resource to you, point you in the right direction, or to link you with our presenters. Please feel free to contact us. You can also go onto the Virginia is for Learners website to find relevant resources. And again, we thank you all so much for joining us here today. Before I jump off, I just want to give Leah an opportunity if she wanted to say anything before we head out. Nope, I think we're all good. Again, thank you, Ted. Thank you, John. We're so grateful for partners like you. And we look forward to having you on our next one. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you,
Have a
everyone.
great evening.
Thank y'all.
Thank you so much.